Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest entry into an initiative that I have titled Quiet Talks in the Community. This one I have decided to call My Only Story. Quiet Talks in the Community, My Only Story. Call it My Only Story because throughout my life here on Earth, closing in on 42 years in December, I've always had attention, wanted or unwanted. Uh, Thought about a interesting interaction I had with a friend of mine when I was at Wayne State, maybe around 2007, 2008. And she seemingly unwillingly just said that, every time we talking about two of our other classmates and friends, she said the conversation just always seems to shift to you. It always seems to involve you, whether it's brief or whatever. And she was saying it, like I said, it was just an interesting vibe. It was just weird. And me being me, adverse to attention, I just kind of soaked it up. And on one hand, I was turning away from it because, like I said, I've been adverse to attention. My mom was talking about it recently. She's always been that way. I feel like I inherited from her. But at the time, especially on the brink of the psychological and spiritual collapse that I had, I just wanted to blurt out, why don't y'all call me then? Why don't you reach out to me if you find yourself always talking about me? How come I don't know that? You understand? And that's another interesting reality where I don't know why, but it seems like I always have to be the one to reach out, to have to connect. And nobody has ever really consistently connected with me or wanted to establish things with me, with the exception of a few important people that I've had in my life. But even then, the dynamics of those connections were, difficult to manage for myself with everything I got going on. So, already going off on a tangent at the start of this, but I feel like it's all important because that's the reason why I call this my only story. Because as she was telling me this when I was around 27, 28 years old, that had always been a part of my life, especially when things were really dark and really bleak for me. I came to terms with, man, I can only imagine the kind of stories that people have told about me, see me at my best or see me at my worst. It's like, what do they think about me? What do they actually know about me? And going what I've gone through and experienced what I've experienced, I have prepared myself, to be as open as I've ever been as I move forward with what I've grown to call my role related responsibilities, here in society, on this planet, and with this species of human. So I'm taking it all the way there. I'm finally comfortable opening up about my spiritual experiences because there's no way that I can continue to talk about my psychological experiences with quote unquote mental illness without finally opening up about my spiritual experiences on my quest to understand the origin and purpose of life, which is what many of us deem to be the truth of God. So that introduction was a crisp 5 minutes. I don't want this to be over an hour because this Quiet Talks in the Community, my only story, is also going to double as an introduction to a podcast I have created that I call Insights and Inquiries from the CCH Approach. So I'll talk more about that towards the end, but right now I want to get into Quiet Talks in the Community, my only story. And the way that I've organized it is I have a list of keywords from my introduction to my podcast. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read off the words and I'm going to talk about my experiences with them. People know me as an obsessively neurotic scientist and professional, so I'm always speaking to jargon and quotes and the latest research, the foundations of research. But this time, I just want to speak from my experiences and just go from there because I spend so much time with my professional self that I have literally cordon off my personal and private self to a lot of people to the point where I've become way too comfortable being reclusive. And the truth of the matter is that was never who I am. You know, I am a people person. I like to be out and about, as we like to say, engaging with people and the elements, you know, but especially during this COVID era and all the professional work I was doing to support individuals, organizations, and families. You know, it took a lot out of me, and I have to pour that back into me, especially moving forward. So the key words start with spirituality. Spirituality, and the second key word is mysticism. So, spirituality and mysticism. Again, in communicating with people that I trust or just talking around individuals, professional, personal, private, you know, they hear me say a lot that it all begins and ends with spirit. It all begins and ends with spirit. And not only is that my belief of existence in life, that's the truth of my life. As far as I can remember, we call it metacognition, thinking about your thinking, aware of your awareness. That's how I came into this planet, is thinking about the origin and the purpose, you know, beyond what I was being told is the origin and purpose. So I am a spiritual mystic, you know, and mysticism, a mystic, it can be defined as an individual who has personal experience, not just following certain doctrines or certain rituals, fellowshipping in certain environments, but they have a personal connection to the spirit of life. And that's something you'll hear me say a lot is that God, for all of its definitions, for me, they are only observations of life itself. So that is how God is all knowing, all powerful, and permeates all things because it is a description of life itself. So taking that approach, and needless to say, it took me a long time to get to that point and accept it for myself, you know, as I've tried to fit in for so long, you know. Let's just say that it's proven itself to me. You know, the spirit, as I have drawn closer to it, with the truth of all that I am, you know, for me, it has proven itself. to be the case. So, and that's one of the reasons why I want to be more open with my personal and private life as I progress to this next stage of it, because I have to tell the truth of my only story because I've had some very powerful experiences. And one that I will mention is the most powerful for me because being scientifically inclined and always trying to rule stuff out as we talk about in diagnosis of mental and emotional and physical disorders. This is the number one experience of 42 years worth of experiences that is the equivalent to what the Bible says, like Moses in the burning bush kind of situations, inexplicable realities that we cannot explain using our five senses and the stories that we've told ourselves and we've allowed other people to tell us. So at the end of 2020, which was a monumental year for us as a species, and we all know the reasons why. Like I said, I was deep in my career as a clinical counselor. I was also an educator, teaching at a local university here in Michigan, as well as doing contractual work, really trying to support. Money is money. I might get into that. But, that is how I was living. And I was completely burned out. I was exhausted. And while I had the economic resources, I decided to go to Hawaii for the first time. I've had a calling to that land, just like Florida, for the longest time in my life. And so I made that decision. I'm going to spend my 40th birthday in the Isles of Hawaii. But because of the decisions that leaders have made, they said that anyone traveling there would have to quarantine for 8 days. And that was going to be the entirety of my trip. So I decided against it. And I felt quite comfortable with the decision I made after that to just staycate. I promised myself 2 weeks off at every solstice, for my self care, doing the work that I did. So I was going to be off for 2 weeks on my birthday, get to stay home, get to not people, as I like to say. And that was my decision. But not too long after that, there was a very familiar burst of energy. Like I said, my internal environment. Some people call it telepathy, all of the above. In religion, we called it that still small voice. And it was literally a burst of energy for about 30 seconds. And I knew that I had to book a trip to Florida for my 40th birthday. And again, that's one of the things about me and my only story is my grandma would always say in spirit and in truth, in spirit and in truth. I have unconsciously been devout to what is called God and what I call life since I can remember. And I'm obedient. So sure enough, in that burst of 30 seconds, within 30 minutes, I had booked a trip to Florida. And I didn't find out why until 2 days into my trip, sitting in my hotel room the night before my birthday on December the 20th, 2020. And I just so happened to look on the weather for that day, and I found that the sun rose in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on December the 20th at 7:03 a.m. And I was floored because the truth, the fact of the matter is that I was born on December the 20th, 1980, in the city of Detroit at 7:03 a.m. So that experience, along with numerous other experiences, is why I'm still alive. Let's just keep it real. Because I was over being here as a human by the time I was about 8 or 9 years old. I just couldn't understand it. So by the time I was 15 and I had the darkest experience of suicide, I had not been living for my own reasons or my own desires. I was either living for the people who loved me and who would grieve and mourn, and their lives would be changed if I wasn't around. But more important than that, I was living for God. I felt there was a reason why I was here, and I've had these kind of experiences. But the more I tried to share them, the more people would say I'm mentally ill. And that kind of drove me to a very difficult life in society. So that's the first and really only story that I'll publicly tell when it comes to my mystical experiences in spirit. And it's the reason why I said I can't honestly talk about mental illness or psychological disorders knowing this is what I have experienced, because it's a fact. All right. So, spirituality and mysticism, I'm all over it. I'm all into it. That's what I love to study. And as I have grown more confident to live in this truth, I am happy and proud of all of these individuals and organizations that I'm finding that are equally enamored by it and studying it. And that's who I am gravitating toward in these last experiences of my life, so I can stand in that truth. So the next two keywords I have on here is cosmology and astronomy. Cosmology and astronomy, as I always said from the beginning, I was just drawn to space. Being the kind of child I was always studying stuff, always trying to learn. And when I first learned about the reality of universes and galaxies and stars and planets, that is what I was drawn to. And that is another thing that helped me to endure as long as I have endured with what I feel are the limitations of the flesh and the limitations of the human society, the good, the bad, the ugly of all of it. I always viewed humans, including myself, as just another species on this very dynamic planet with a very impressive array of biodiversity. So that also contributed to the challenges I've had, because I've always had experiences where I'm completely detached from my flesh, from society. And when I would neglect it for periods at a time in my life, that's another thing that brought about the onset of what they call mental and emotional illness. But it was always because I was focused so much on the truth of the stars, the truth of the cosmos. Why are we really here? What's really going on? So money and sex and clothes and cars and jobs and all of that other stuff, it just literally seemed artificial to me. It seemed foreign to me. And it has been a challenge to pretend like it is important the way so many people around me and the way presentations in this society deemed that not only is it important, it's the only thing of importance. I just never could get with it, you know? And that's why when I talk about spirituality and mysticism, and then I expanded into cosmology and astronomy, that's how I was able to grow, you know, in my faith and ground myself, as we like to say in mindfulness, here and accepting that this is what it is, but always staying focused on the truth of spiritual expansion, as this says in the word, from everlasting to everlasting. That's where my consciousness extends to. So the next two keywords then will be transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. Again, these are very dynamic fields. I want to not judge, but merely describe as best I can these experiences. But yeah, when I expanded in my career as a student and then a trainee and then a professional in post-secondary education, I was shocked and kind of relieved to hear about all of these different disciplines, all of these different fields, and all of these very trustworthy people that are boldly working in these fields. You know, transpersonal psychology, there's a big, beautiful handbook on it, and there's case studies on it, but you don't hear anything about it. You don't hear anything about it in what I call the mainstream and the top of the pyramid, what they call the ivory tower in education. But thank God that they're there, you know, because again, it helped me to ground myself and settle myself with my experiences. And it gave me more confidence to speak on it because another recent reality that I've accepted, seeing in the mainstream, at least of entertainment, that, you know, ghost hunting and demon hunting and spirituality, all of this stuff is out there in the open. But it was a cultural thing for me. I come from a culture and a community in Black urban America, one of the subcultures, I call it the mainstream subculture. And any talk of witches and witchcraft and ghosts and all this other stuff, you know, it's completely dismissed and you're not engaged if you talk about that stuff, at least in this subculture. So, just like so much of what I've experienced in my life, I accept that it's my barriers that I placed upon myself, even in acceptance of what others think I should or shouldn't do, be or shouldn't be. And even now at 41 years old, going on 42, it's still something that is deeply buried in me that makes me uncomfortable talking about these mystical experiences like being born on December the 20th, 1980 at 7:03 a.m. and through a 30-second burst of energy coming from within me going down to Florida because the spirit knew that on my 40th birthday the sun would rise at 7:03, my exact time of birth. I was even concerned with telling people that when it is documented, you can see it as a fact. You don't have to accept it as true. It's a fact, you know? So that's why that's what I've always trusted, and it's what I will always trust. I celebrate all faiths, all religions, any and all creatures' depiction and description of God because I know it's just life. and it's their experiences, and those who choose to war with others because of it or kill others because of it, that's them. That's their relationship with it. I'm finally boldly stepping into speaking my truth and still being able to maintain my professional self, which was another concern. And that's why I'm so passionate about transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. And I would have to throw in abnormal psychology as well, because I feel like those are the bridges from what we call the metaphysical, beyond physical life, to the physical. And for those who are like me, who were indoctrinated, for lack of a better word, into only seeing existence from this point of view. And something that I said to my grandma, who was my spiritual teacher and the minister of the church I grew up in, I would tell her, even as a child, it's like, I'm uncomfortable hearing all of these humans bind that which is boundless, saying God is this and only this, He's that and only that. It's like, that's dangerous to me, to have such a limited creature speak upon such expansive things, you know? But I won't go down there. So, transpersonal psychology, parapsychology, abnormal psychology. So, all of these keywords are going to be the themes that I talk about, and again, here and there in my professional life, but everywhere in my personal and private life, I'm making it a point to speak more openly about the facts of my life and how I see the world. Again, not preaching or proselytizing, but just describing my experiences. And this episode of Quiet Talks in the Community and introducing my podcast, Insights and Inquiries from the CCH Approach, that's the significance of me doing this. Okay. So we'll now go into quantum theory. I'll briefly speak about my understanding of that, because just like a lot of the other realities in nature that you'll find, it is the proof that God exists and life exists from everlasting to everlasting, and it provides rational and understandable realities, for me at least, that helps me to accept all of these mystical experiences that I've had with my limited brain and my scientifically ingrained mind. So quantum theory, the best I can describe it, it talks about two major themes of how entanglement, meaning that once you are born of a certain energetic essence, that which is you and that which is that essence will always have particles that connect with each other. A part of you will always be a part of it. So no matter how far you may travel in your experiences, you will always have a connection to that source of your origin. And they call that quantum entanglement. And a manifestation of that I use to try to explain it to people who really want to know is like, take a parent and their child. That child who was born of that mother will not only share physical particles between them, there is a non-physical bond between them. There's a connection between them. So even if that child grows to be an adult and moves halfway around the world, there's always that connection, that bond. And sometimes we call it love. So quantum entanglement is one of those scientific realities that we're trying to learn more about that speaks to our connection to the source, which is life, that we call God. That's how we were able to communicate. That's why, in a burst of 30 seconds, I had this invitation to go down to Florida when I was completely comfortable sitting at home and not peopling for 2 weeks. It was a quantum communication. And the second thing that I understand and focus on with quantum theory is the reality that speaks to particles don't really exist until they're observed. Again, it's mind bending stuff, literally, but there's research that physicists do that has shown that a particle's shape or form changes if it is observed versus if it's not observed. And that connects to a phrase, a statement that is old as antiquity when people say that you don't see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. And even the physical structure of our eyes that we have studied, how light comes in and reflects off of a surface inside of us and then projects back out. And that's why people can be looking at the same thing but see completely two different things. It's why people can be sitting shoulder to shoulder but existing in completely different dimensions of space and time. So again, that's as far as I'll go with it because it's mind bending stuff. These are my insights, these are my inquiries, these are my experiences, and these are the things that I want to talk about. These are the things I only want to talk about. Something else that drove me to have the distresses that I've had and ultimately isolate myself is because I couldn't find anybody that want to talk about this stuff, that's interested in this stuff. You know what I'm saying? Even professionals, when I was seeking mental health care, trying to be as clear and coherent, as concise as possible, and they still looking at me checking off boxes and trying to stamp me as ill. Moving on. So from this list, I will next talk about ecology. Ecology, and yeah, let me just rest with ecology right now because ecology is the dynamic environment and it is a creature's relationship with their environment. And I have always not just studied nature, I felt nature. I felt that quantum connection to the elements. That's why I love being here in Michigan. And right now, I'm recording this on the banks of Lake St. Clair. You know, it's big, beautiful lake. You know, I've always felt the Great Lakes surrounding me, even though I haven't spent as much time on them as others have. Just knowing they're there, just like the trees, I can feel them, you know, and that's another big, big divider and barrier that humans are experiencing on this planet because this artificial matrix that has been built on top of it. Again, I don't want to be as confrontational and adversarial as I once was. I want to be understanding and accepting of how people experience the world. But when it pushes you around and kicks you in the bum and literally mocks you for wanting to not live that way, it's like having to pay to come up in here. Oh, you got to pay us because we own this. I'm not going to get into it. That's the artificial matrix. That's how a creation like money that does not have to exist on this planet for the ecology to thrive. In fact, it's a barrier to it. That's one of the reasons why I feel so much is going on spiritually the way that it's going on. Because certain things in nature just cannot continue lest there be destruction. It's just like a human. If you drink too much for too long, you're going to die. If you choose to pick up a projectile firing instrument and put it to your heart and pull the trigger, your body will cease to function. That's nature. So these artificial matrices that are put above the original dynamics of the ecological dynamics between creatures and their environment. That's one of the reasons spiritually we're seeing so much human evolution and so much fighting against it. So that's one of the things that drives me in my humanity as I continue to grow, as I want to learn as much as I can. How to be as natural as possible and living in alignment with the ecology of the environment. Um, what's that one that they call it? Bioregions. When I was studying this and learning about it, bioregions of the earth, that's not just a dynamic physical reality, but it's also individuals and organizations are advocating for a reshaping of how we live to be more in alignment with bioregions. So, again, all of this stuff, especially the stuff I don't know so much about as a human and as a professional, man, when I get in front of people or I'm watching programs or that I can trust, and I know that they're just like me trying to learn and trying to study and trying to do the best that they can, man, I get silent and I get that head tilt like when I was 7 years old. And I don't care who the person is. If they can teach me something I don't know, I'm all ears and my mouth is closed, you know? So yeah, that's ecology. What are we, 37 minutes? Alrighty. So next from the list, I'd like to go into logic philosophy. Keyword logic philosophy is also a very important reality for me. It was the first class that I took at Oakland University in the summer of 2011, and this was after that major psychological breakdown in the summer of 2010. I was getting myself together, and it was a critically important class because it introduced the importance of language. And the two themes that I remember the most, other than the difficulty of the mathematic equations that they created using logic philosophy, is like universal affirmations and universal negations. And it really created a new foundation for myself and my understanding and the work that I do with people, is because it talked about seemingly simple statements like all men are this or all women are that or no women are this or no men are that. That's a universal statement when you say all, but it is not a factual statement because you haven't met all women. You haven't met all men. So what that speaks to is something that we call a narrative in psychology. A narrative. That's what you are telling yourself. But if you look around on the screens that we hold in our hands and we have in our homes, you can see how these narratives permeate into people's mindsets. And think about how often you yourself or somebody else says everybody is this, or all people are that, or all people aren't that. When you are using logic philosophy, you have the science to point that out. And it's critically important to point that out because once I learned about all of this, again, I hold myself accountable more than anybody else. That's the only way I've gotten to where I've gotten to. So it's not difficult for me to hold other people accountable for their learning, their healing, and their growing because nature demands it. But that kind of universal affirmation or negation, that's something that we really need to teach more so people can understand and improve the way that they communicate. Because not only is it a barrier to learning and understanding, it can be an intentional act of manipulation to where people create the expectation that, yeah, this is the truth. This is what everybody does, so therefore it's what I'm supposed to do. That's why I put logic philosophy on it, and I definitely want to revisit that course and that science because there's still more learning to do. And it is something that I hope to eventually start teaching more in the work that I do. Again, even personally and privately. All right, so that's logic philosophy. Got a couple more. Again, not gonna let any of these go past 60 minutes. So the next two I'll connect is cultural psychology and cultural anthropology. So again, cultural psychology taught the course again at the university level and for high school students. It was a great experience, a great learning community. That's always my focus when I'm teaching. We're all learning together. And the Handbook of Cultural Psychology, its second edition, again, it's a very robust text, but there's a lot of really good, up to date information in there that helps us to understand where we have come from and what we're experiencing and where we need to go to be the best that we can be as a collective species of creatures that we call human. And it is comforting to me because one of the things that I remember reading as I was reviewing and studying and preparing, it talks about how direct quote saying that while researchers labor in the fields, the world outside of the ivory tower needs their interventions more than ever. And if you know my history, if you followed me for the past few years, secretly or not, then you know about my history again of Black nationalism and separatism and being an adversary to the state. And certain terms like ivory tower or deep state was terms that I only heard in the circles that I ran with. I never heard it in the mainstream. And even in the circles that I ran with and the things that I studied, even then it was spoken about with hushed tones. So to hear and to read this textbook talking about the ivory tower, again, it's something that humbled me and helped me further ground myself and try to keep working with those who are working to improve. Like I would tell myself when I first made the decision to start going to school and paying taxes and have a job and stuff like that. It's like, bro, not everybody on the take. Not everybody is part of this nefarious collective to regress humans and herd them into animal like states. You know what I'm saying? There are individuals who are out here really trying to help and really trying to teach. And you either gonna be a part of it or you're not. That's that accountability part. Just like when we're talking about behavioral change, behavior modification. You either do it or you don't. Regardless of your barriers, that's just it. So cultural psychology, again, it talks about how there's so many different definitions of it, but the main focus is shared ideas and practices. And that's something we got to grow to understand, that culture's best definition is the shared ideas and practices of groups of individuals. And it can be by race or skin pigmentation. It can be by region. It can be by economics, but it's all shared ideas and practices. And whether a person is a part of it or whether a person rejects it, that's all cultural psychology. And again, if we want to continue to help and we want to continue to support, it's going to be very important to speak to the letters, as I like to call the sciences, and to try to be as accurate as possible and to move beyond just our thoughts and our feelings about a reality, but to really get into the objective facts of what we know and what we hope to know. And that goes in hand with cultural anthropology. Again, anthropology has four sub-disciplines as well, and cultural anthropology is the one I most focus on. And again, it just studies, in a ethnographic nature. Ethnographic meaning the origin of these ideas and practices and how they come about and what it looks like when people accept them versus what it looks like when people reject them. And that's another thing I love about the handbook is it talks about how our neurology, the biochemical makeup of our bodies, just like we talked about with quantum theory and quantum entanglement, how it can change in response to how you are reared, how you were raised. And that's the progression we started with and we need to keep going toward. It started with nature versus nurture, and nature versus nurture, meaning, is it in the nature of a human to just be a certain way, or is it the way that they're nurtured? And we did our research, we did our observations, all of the above, and then it expanded to nature and nurture. Both of them have an impact on a human's development, on their understanding of what I call what motivates them to act. And the latest thing that we have is nature through nurture. Nature through nurture. And just like this big, beautiful blue lake can turn black with death if we dump oil in it, if you are nurturing a creature to be subservient, to be violent, to be aggressive, then their nature can change. We do understand that about the reality of physical reality. But again, that's why I started with spirituality and mysticism, because what we observe and what we think we know can always change when you're talking about the dynamic nature of existence. I've experienced it for myself, and that's why I'm so adamant about continue learning, healing, and growing, because we have the expanse of Eternia to fill in, to reach. So we don't want to get stuck, and we sure don't want to regress. My grandma used to scream it from the pulpit. I refuse to move backwards. If I can't move forward, I'll just stand still. And that's an adamant part of what I do and how I teach, because we always want to be progressing to the highest heights that we can reach. Okay. So this is about 11 minutes left. Wrapping it all up, the last keywords I have on here is developmental psychology, qualitative research, logotherapy, subjective well-being, and optimum wellness. So all of these things, and you notice it descends down from the spiritual to the physical. So all of these encompasses my work that I will continue to do with humans moving forward. So developmental psychology, human lifespan development, it's one of my favorite disciplines, and it's how I live, it's how I teach, it's how I practice, because we always want to be mindful of a human stage of development. You know, the way that I define it, it's the 0 to 7 is the golden years. 0 to 7, those are the golden years. And then the silver years is the identity formation stage, as they call it in Erickson's lifespan development, which is probably the most prominent that we use. And I use 8 to 12. 8 to 12 is the identity formation stage. I call those the silver years. And then we go into the teenage years, the blue years. That's 13 to 19. And from 20 to 39, from 20 to 39, I call that emerging adulthood. All of that is emerging adulthood. Some researchers don't even like to use emerging adulthood at all, but if they do use it, it's like between the ages of maybe 18 to 25. But experiencing what I've experienced, and in the way that I teach and the way that I practice, emerging adulthood lasts from 20 years old to 39 years old. And that is the blue years. Then we go into the pink years. The pink years of middle adulthood is 40 to 69 years old. That's middle adulthood. And then the violet years is the 70 plus year olds. That's older adulthood. So, human lifespan development. I've also worked with adults and youth with special needs. So, we always have to take that reality of functioning into consideration. But the phrase we like to use is age and developmentally appropriate. Age and developmentally appropriate in functioning. And if that is the case, then again, as my grandma would say, it's we as a species, it's once an adult, twice a child. Once an adult, twice a child. And that means that the cyclical nature of our experiences is that we literally revert back to the lower functioning of childhood in our current series of incarnations as humans. And I'm saying it like that because, again, there's a lot of metaphysical realities and some physical realities that can challenge that, that can say humans can live a lot longer and thrive a lot longer. But again, what we have and what we know right now, this is where we are. Okay, so developmental psychology, we always focus on and we never focus beyond a level of functioning in that person's stage of development. Qualitative research and logotherapy and subjective well being. I'm going to put all of those together because that is the primary focus of everything that I do. I work to empower people. And as I always say, professionally and privately and personally, you are the expert in you. Nobody knows you better than you know you. Just like my days of challenging research when I first got to post-secondary education. It's like, yeah, y'all got all this research, but my mans and them around the corner, they wasn't in that population. They wasn't in the experimental group or the control group. So what about them? And thankfully, as I progressed, I met and learned more brave humans who took that upon themselves to expand it. And that's where we come up with person-centered treatment, where the individual's narrative, in social work, we call it your subjective well-being. How do you view your quality of life? How do you view this treatment you're receiving? What are your wants and your needs? Not what these books say you want and you need. It's your experiences, it's your life. And that's what we always try to do to empower people. And that's where logotherapy comes from, created by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and most famous for a book called Man's Search for Meaning that we had to read in a wellness, health promotion, and injury prevention class I took at OU. And that's where I first learned about Viktor Frankl, but it wasn't until I progressed to really focus on what he was talking about with meaning and narrative and implementing logotherapy in the way that I practice to empower people to create their own meaning because that connects to that quantum reality. You are the observer. You are the observer of your experiences. And although you may not be able to control everything that's going on in this reality, you can control how you respond to it. And that's what they mean when you say you create your own reality, because your responses determine what it's going to be for you. Okay. And the last thing that I'll mention as I wrap up is optimum wellness. Optimum wellness. So, in my introduction to the CCH approach, again, that hour and 40-minute introduction is kind of like an intake into doing the work that I do and working with me or understanding me. I define optimum wellness as the integration of a person's physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual wellness. So, physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual, these are the dynamic dimensions that makes up one human being. It's like the layers of the planet. You have the stratosphere, the lithosphere, magnetosphere, atmosphere, but then you got the crust and you got the core. You have these deep ocean seas. You have these dry, barren lands. You have Arctic, frigid landscapes. You have blazing hot landscapes, but it's all in one earth, one dynamic body. And that's how I work with myself and how I work with others is the separate consideration of the physical, the mental, the emotional, the social, the spiritual, but always understanding that it's part of that one dynamic whole. And one adverse reality, let's say in your physical experience, can diminish, if not destroy, the others. Just like a thriving spiritual life can enhance and improve all of the others. So that's this introduction. This has been Quiet Talks in the Community, my only story. And this I will consider my first episode of Insights and Inquiries from the CCH Approach. Hope people will enjoy it. I am making it a point to be more available and more accessible. So you can email me at Chris, CHRIS, at ccharrispc.com. You can look me up at ccharrispc.com. And again, I really and truly hope people continue to expand because, again, finishing with another quote from my grandma, God, aka life, has given you as far as your eyes can see and beyond. the expanse of Eternia is yours from everlasting to everlasting, but instead some people can only see past the tip of their nose. And I am wanting to support individuals, unions, and collectives in their ability to expand. But just like lifespan development and the realities of nature, as I like to say when I'm working with children and their parents, we play the long game when it comes to lifespan development. So, peace, love, plenty blessings, and we'll catch you on the next episode.